used to believe that walking away was the purest form of peace, but when my sister discovered my $12 million at Thanksgiving, snooping through my private emails while pretending to help set the dinner table, something old and dark in me woke up, something I thought I had buried years ago. The moment she screamed, "Is this real?" and the entire family fell silent, forks mid-air, judgment in their eyes, I realized they had never seen me as a person, only as a resource they'd somehow been denied access to for years. And what followed was a flood of accusations disguised as concern. My mother demanding to know why I hid money from them, my uncle insisting I owed the family support, my father calmly declaring I needed to put at least $2 million into a family fund, as if I were some reluctant member of a corporation instead of their estranged child who once begged them for help and was met with polite excuses and locked doors. As they circled me, their voices rising, my sister crying about how I betrayed them by succeeding alone, something in me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly. The kind of snap you only hear inside yourself, the one that tells you a chapter has closed for good. So I stood up, took my coat, and left the house without a word, feeling their shock burn into my back like headlights in the dark. In the days that followed, their anger metastasized into entitlement, then desperation, then threats. Long messages telling me I'd ruined the family, voicemails where my mother sobbed and begged while my father alternated between cold fury and faux forgiveness, all assuming I would eventually break, crawl back, and hand over the money to restore some imaginary equilibrium. But instead, I changed my number, blocked them everywhere, and sat with a strange, growing clarity. Their version of love had always been conditional, and now that I had something they wanted, they simply dropped the pretense. But revenge, true revenge, isn't about hurting someone. It's about making them face what they've always been. So I did nothing, said nothing, offered nothing, letting their own greed turn them against each other. My sister accused my parents of pushing me away. My parents blamed her for invading my privacy. My uncle spread rumors that I'd always been ungrateful. And within a month, they were fighting openly, their once tight family unit cracking under the pressure of a future wealth they believed they deserved but didn't have access to. The only person I didn't block was my cousin Megan, the one family member who never treated me like a burden when I was young, and she was the only one who emailed me without asking for a cent. Just a quiet apology for the chaos and a reminder that I didn't owe anyone anything, especially not people who never showed up when I needed them most. Her message softened something in me, not toward my parents or siblings, but toward myself, giving me permission to see my past clearly. The years of being ignored, belittled, blamed, and dismissed had conditioned me to believe that any kindness I gave them was an investment that might one day be reciprocated. But the truth was, they had never seen my humanity, only my usefulness, and now that I could finally offer something substantial, they mistook my silence for cruelty rather than the boundary it actually was. Their final attempt at reconciliation, a group email on Christmas morning declaring they were ready to forgive me if I transferred money before New Year's, was so absurdly condescending that I laughed out loud, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, realizing for the first time just how powerless they felt now that I no longer needed anything from them. That was when the nature of my revenge crystallized. Not rage, not confrontation, not exposing their hypocrisy, but simply erasing their influence from my life so completely that my existence no longer revolved around their approval or affection. I donated nothing to them, replied to no messages, and never again drove past their house or entertained the idea of returning for holidays, letting the silence grow heavier and heavier until they were forced to confront the truth that the bridge they burned out of entitlement was one they had secretly believed I would always be forced to rebuild. Instead, I built something entirely new: peace, boundaries, self-respect, and the last act of my revenge was quiet but intentional. I created a trust fund for Megan's future children, a gesture she might never know about, but one that symbolized the difference between family by blood and family by choice. Meanwhile, my parents and sister continue to stew in their own narratives, telling anyone who will listen that I'm cold, selfish, vindictive, never realizing that the deepest cut of all is not that I hurt them, it's that I no longer need to. The silence that followed my disappearance from their lives didn't just create distance, it created a vacuum. And vacuums have a way of sucking in every unresolved fear, guilt, and resentment people try to hide. So while I settled into my quiet new life, my family spiraled in the shadow of unanswered questions they believed they deserved answers to. My mother tried to track me down through old acquaintances, my father reached out to former coworkers, and my sister combed through social media as if decoding my absence would somehow give her access to my wealth. But all of them misinterpreted the situation in the same predictable way. They assumed my retreat was a dramatic performance meant to manipulate them, not the final boundary of someone who had stopped trying to win love from people incapable of giving it. Megan was the first to tell me the extent of their unraveling. Her messages were gentle but honest, describing how my parents' home had become a battleground of arguments, accusations, and desperate bargaining. My mother insisting that she must have pushed me too hard, my father blaming her emotional softness, and my sister claiming she was the victim all along, that I had somehow tricked her into invading my privacy, painting herself as a scapegoat even though she was the one who opened the laptop, snooped through my email, and detonated everything out of impulsive entitlement. And as Megan's updates continued, I realized something unsettling. My family wasn't grieving losing me. They were grieving losing access to me, to my money, to the future they imagined I would finance for them. And this realization deepened the particular flavor of my revenge. I didn't need to expose them, humiliate them, or confront them because they were already devouring themselves in the empty space where my compliance used to be. Meanwhile, people in their social circle began asking questions. Why did their son vanish? Why did he change his number? Why was there sudden tension at every family gathering? Questions they answered with carefully crafted half-truths that painted them as wounded parents abandoned by an ungrateful child. But their stories contradicted each other, and contradictions breed suspicion. And soon people whispered, quietly at first, then openly, wondering what kind of family loses a child over miscommunication. My father, a man who once cared about nothing more than looking respectable, began cracking under the pressure, especially after a longtime neighbor confronted him about how he had treated me growing up. That confrontation rattled him so deeply, he stopped sitting on the porch, choosing instead to stay inside the house with the blinds drawn, paranoid that every glance, every whisper, every passing conversation was about him. And maybe they were. My mother coped differently. She tried to rewrite history, revisiting my childhood memories in her mind, but editing them until she believed her own lies, telling herself she never saw the bruises, never heard the arguments, never sensed the fear in me, convincing herself she had been a good mother who simply made mistakes. But memory manipulation only works when no one challenges it. And my absence challenged it relentlessly, the silence forcing her to confront the versions of herself she had avoided for decades. The real collapse, though, came from my sister, who could not stand the idea that she was the catalyst for losing access to millions. And so she tried to rebuild her image by harassing Megan for information, sending her long messages about how she just wanted to help and didn't mean to cause trouble. But Megan didn't buy it. She knew my sister's patterns too well, had watched her manipulate people into believing she was the victim every time she made a selfish decision. And for the first time in her life, my sister's charm stopped working, leaving her furious, isolated, and convinced that she was being unfairly punished. She even tried contacting my old college friends, some of whom she had never met, pretending to be concerned about my mental state. But they all forwarded her messages to me, incredulous at her hypocrisy, and I responded the same way every time, with nothing. Because nothingness is a mirror, and in that mirror, people have to face themselves. As weeks turned to months, the psychological pressure began cracking my family like old porcelain. My father grew paranoid enough to install cameras around the house, certain that I or someone connected to me was watching him. My mother took to pacing the living room late at night, replaying old memories out loud as if saying them differently could rewrite the past. And my sister developed a habit of posting cryptic rants online about betrayal and loyalty, attempting to gather sympathy from strangers since no one close to her believed her anymore. They were unraveling publicly, privately, and internally, and I didn't lift a finger. I simply existed elsewhere, building a life where I didn't have to apologize for succeeding alone. A life where peace felt like an earned inheritance rather than a forbidden luxury. But revenge has a way of deepening even when you don't intend it to. And one day, Megan emailed me something that made the quiet fury in my chest exhale with satisfaction. My parents had finally confronted my sister, not about me, but about her constant obsession with my money, accusing her of being the reason I vanished. And for the first time, she exploded, shouting every dark truth she had ever swallowed, admitting she felt overshadowed by me her entire life, admitting she hated that I escaped the family's dysfunction while she stayed trapped, admitting she resented me long before the money ever appeared. And in that chaos, they all realized something I had known for years. Their loyalty was never love, only convenience. And once convenience disappeared, so did any illusion of unity. That night, Megan told me the three of them stopped speaking altogether, retreating into different corners of their fractured home, each blaming the other two for losing the one thing they valued more than me, access. And as I read her message sitting in the soft glow of my quiet apartment, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even closure, but a calm understanding that my greatest act of revenge hadn't been leaving. It had been finally living somewhere they could no longer follow. In the months that followed their implosion, I watched from afar, not with glee, but with a curious, detached ache. The kind that forms when you realize the family who raised you is finally confronting the truth you lived with your entire life. And though I wasn't there physically, every update from Megan painted a picture of slow, inevitable collapse. My father retreating deeper into isolation, letting the house rot around him while he replayed old conversations in his head, muttering to himself about respect and authority, as though rehearsing the past could restore the control he once held. My mother dissolving into quiet despair, calling relatives who no longer answered, walking around the house, touching the furniture like it held answers she no longer remembered, and my sister lashing out publicly, privately, and pathetically, posting cryptic messages online about toxic families and betrayal, while simultaneously begging distant cousins to intervene on her behalf, hoping someone, anyone, would convince me to return, apologize, and restore the fantasy where she was still the center of every story. But the truth, the unavoidable truth, was that none of them missed me. They missed the version of me that needed them, the version they could control, the version that apologized for things he didn't do just to keep the peace, the version they believed would eventually circle back out of guilt or habit. But that version of me was gone, and in his absence, they floundered like people trying to swim through memories that no longer stayed still. Part of me wondered if I should feel guilty for letting them drown in their own dysfunction, but guilt requires belief in wrongdoing, and all I had done was step away from a fire they'd spent years pretending wasn't burning the house down. Meanwhile, my own life grew steadier, softer, almost quietly sacred. I found a rhythm in my days, waking early to write, running in the evenings, cooking meals that filled my apartment with warmth, learning how to exist without the constant anticipation of emotional ambush. And it amazed me how peaceful a life becomes when no one is waiting to take something from you. Yet revenge, I learned, is not a single event. It is a long echo. And one afternoon, that echo took shape when I received an unexpected message from a lawyer representing my parents.
He wanted to discuss the possibility of reconciliation and estate considerations, a phrase so absurd I laughed aloud because it meant they were terrified, financially and emotionally, that I would never come back, and now they were scrambling to reframe themselves as flawed but loving parents so I might feel compelled to include them in the future they once tried to demand from me. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded the email to Megan, who replied within minutes, telling me that my parents had begun telling extended family they were ready to make amends and wanted me to come home so we could heal together. But those lies crumbled quickly when relatives asked the obvious question, "What exactly are you apologizing for?" The silence that followed exposed everything, and soon my parents were cornered by their own inability to acknowledge the harm they had caused, leading to more fights, more denial, more emotional erosion, until the story they had crafted to protect themselves fell apart under the weight of collective scrutiny. My sister, desperate to reclaim even a shred of control, attempted one last tactic. She contacted my ex, spinning a tale of concern about my mental state, implying I was unstable, isolated, possibly a danger to myself, hoping, I assume, that my ex would reach out to me and pull me back into the world she believed I'd built around avoidance and self-pity. Instead, my ex forwarded me the message with a simple note, "She's lying. I'm sorry." And as I read my sister's frantic fiction, I realized something vital. This was not about money anymore. It was about losing the narrative, the power, the hierarchy that had always placed her above me. And in losing that, she had lost the identity she built from the illusion of superiority. The psychological break was inevitable. According to Megan, my sister eventually confronted my parents in a screaming match that lasted nearly an hour, accusing them of letting me disappear, choosing me over her, and ruining her life. And in that tantrum, every carefully constructed lie they'd told themselves collapsed, leaving only raw truth. They had pushed me away, long before I ever walked out the door. For the first time, my parents saw her manipulation clearly, how she twisted every situation, weaponized every emotion, and blamed everyone but herself. And instead of comforting her, they withdrew, stunned by the realization that the daughter they had protected so fiercely had been the root of much of the chaos they once blamed on me. Their silence broke her. She moved out shortly after, unable to tolerate the shift in power, and the family that had once fed on denial now fed on absence, each of them living in their own private shards of the shattered whole they once pretended to be. Through all of it, I said nothing, did nothing, demanded nothing. My revenge had never been about forcing them to suffer. It was about forcing them to see themselves without the buffer of my compliance. And in that stillness, that simple refusal to re-enter their orbit, something extraordinary happened. They were left alone with the truth. And in that truth, they finally realized that losing me wasn't a temporary tantrum or emotional outburst, it was permanent.
In the end, the strangest part of revenge wasn't the destruction, it was the quiet afterward, the settling dust, the stillness in which I finally understood that what I had been chasing all this time wasn't vengeance at all, but liberation, the right to exist without the weight of people who only loved the version of me that served them. The final unraveling began the day Megan told me my parents had put the house up for sale. The same house where I spent years trying to shrink myself small enough to survive, where every bruise became a lesson and every silence became a warning. She said they were downsizing, but we both knew the real truth. They could no longer stand to live in a place filled with ghosts of the past they had tried so hard to bury. And with my absence carving a permanent gap through their memories, the walls themselves had become unbearable. My father, once the immovable force of our household, now shuffled like a man decades older, carrying boxes and muttering about mistakes and misinterpretations, unable to reconcile the man he believed himself to be with the father I remembered. My mother clung to old photo albums, flipping through pages as if searching for proof that she had been loving, that she had been kind, that she had not failed me in ways she never admitted out loud. And the more she tried to find comfort in the glossy rectangles of the past, the more she realized that guilt had seeped into every corner of her memory.
My sister didn't help with the move. She was living on her own again, nursing fresh resentments and telling new stories about how she was the wronged one, how she was abandoned by both me and our parents, crafting a mythology where she was a tragic figure instead of a woman confronting the consequences of her own entitlement. As their lives fractured further, Megan continued to offer gentle updates, never cruel, never gleeful, just quietly observant, like someone watching the final stages of an illness run its course. She told me how my father refused to tell anyone where they were moving, paranoid that neighbors were judging him, how my mother cried whenever she passed my old bedroom, insisting she never knew and wishing she could turn back time, unaware that regret without accountability is just another form of self-pity. But the moment that cemented the end, truly cemented it, came in the form of a letter my parents mailed to the address Megan had for me, the first direct communication they attempted since the day I walked out. It wasn't an apology, not a real one. It was a soft, hesitant, half-hearted attempt at remorse, full of phrases like, "We didn't realize, we did our best, we wish things had been different." And beneath it all lay the obvious attempt to preserve some future claim on my life, or at least my money, wrapped gently in the language of reconciliation. I read it slowly, every sentence a reminder of how deeply my family had relied on denial as a survival mechanism. And when I finished, I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just clarity. They still didn't understand. They might never. And that was the final piece of revenge. Not that they suffered, but that I no longer needed anything from them. Not answers, not apologies, not acknowledgement, not even closure. Their understanding was no longer a prerequisite for my healing. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to their neighborhood one last time, not to confront them, not to stand outside like a shadow, but to say goodbye to the place that had built me through pain and shaped me through survival. I parked down the street, watched as movers carried boxes out of the house, noticed how small my father looked as he supervised, how fragile my mother appeared clinging to a bag of old photo frames. And I realized that they were not villains in their own story. They were simply people too scared to face the truth of who they were, and that terror had carved deeper wounds in them than anything I could have inflicted. I didn't get out of the car. They never saw me. Instead, I whispered something I once thought I'd never be strong enough to say. "I release you." Then I left the street, the house, the town, and the entire history behind me. My revenge was not the collapse of their lives. It was the reconstruction of my own, the life I built piece by piece with intention, boundaries, and peace. The life I protected fiercely because I had earned it through years of surviving people who claimed to love me. And in that new life, something remarkable happened. The silence that once felt like a weapon became a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without the pressure of expectation, where my success belonged only to me, where my future was shaped by my choices rather than their demands. Sometimes, late at night, I think about my sister's obsession, my mother's denial, my father's pride, and I realize that the greatest revenge was not giving them what they wanted, but leaving them with what they created, a world where they had to face themselves without me as the scapegoat, the buffer, or the bridge. And as for me, I finally stepped into a life that was mine alone, carrying no anger, only understanding that the truest form of revenge is not destruction, but release, walking away so completely that the past can never claim you again.